On July 12, 2024, a man named Matthew Ristelli drove from California to Utah with the intention of bringing his wife and 2 children home. He never made it out of his mother-in-law's house alive. What happened inside that home that evening would reveal a family conspiracy so calculated, so deliberate, that even after a jury convicted the shooter of murder, they would acquit him of the very conspiracy he confessed to orchestrating. This is the case of Kevin Ellis and the murder of Matthew Ristelli, a case where the evidence of planning was overwhelming, where the execution was methodical, but where legal technicalities would split a jury's verdict in ways that seemed to defy logic. Matthew Ristelli was 42 years old, a father of 2, a man with a marriage that was falling apart. He and his wife, Catherine Ristelli, had been having serious marital problems. The kind of problems that marriages don't recover from. The kind that lead to divorce. Catherine had taken their 2 children and moved out of their California home. She told Matthew she was going to stay with her mother, Tracy Grist, in American Fork, Utah, for a few weeks to think things through. That was the story. That was what she told him. But the truth was something else entirely. According to prosecutors, Catherine Ristelli had no intention of reconciliation. She had no intention of returning to California, and she had no intention of bringing their children back to Matthew. Instead, she had made a decision, along with her mother and her brother, to kill him. To lure him to Utah under false pretenses and have him murdered when he arrived. It is a story that strains credulity at first hearing because it seems too calculated, too cruel, too premeditated to be real. But the evidence shows it was all of those things and more. Tracy Grist, the mother, was described by prosecutors as the mastermind of the plot. She was obsessed with true crime. She had researched similar cases online. She had studied how other people had committed murders and gotten away with them, or at least how they had tried. And somewhere in that research, in that obsession, a plan took shape. A plan to kill her son-in-law. A plan to remove him from the picture so that her daughter could keep the children and keep the money and keep the life she wanted to live. The plan was simple on the surface, but required precise execution. Catherine would tell Matthew that she wanted to reconcile, that she missed him, that she wanted to try again, that he should come to Utah and pick her up, pick up the children, and they could all go home together. Matthew, desperate to save his marriage, desperate to get his family back, would believe her. He would get in his truck, he would drive from California to Utah, and when he walked through the door of his mother-in-law's home, he would be shot and killed. But before any of that could happen, there were details to manage. Tracy Grist needed to know when Matthew would arrive. She needed to be prepared. She needed to know his location. So Catherine placed a tracker in his truck. Not an obvious one, a hidden one. And as Matthew drove from California to Utah, his wife and his mother-in-law watched his location on a map. They discussed when he would arrive. They texted about it. They planned around it. They waited for him. The text messages between Catherine and her mother Tracy are perhaps the most damning evidence of premeditation in this case. Prosecutors presented them to the jury. Messages discussing Matthew's arrival time, messages about the plan, messages that revealed the coordination between mother and daughter. These were not messages between people making a spontaneous decision. These were messages between people executing a plan they had already decided on, a plan they had committed to, a plan that would end in murder. Kevin Ellis was the executor of that plan. He was Catherine's brother, Tracy's son. He was the one who would pull the trigger. On the evening of July 12, 2024, Kevin Ellis was waiting in his mother's home in American Fork, Utah. He was armed. He was ready. And when Matthew Rastelli walked through the door, Kevin Ellis shot him. 7 times. 7 shots from a firearm. 7 attempts to make sure Matthew Rastelli was dead. The amount of force used speaks to intent. Self-defense does not typically involve 7 shots. Self-defense is a reaction to an immediate threat. It is a moment of fear and survival. 7 shots is execution. 7 shots is determination. 7 shots is making sure the job is done. Kevin Ellis shot Matthew Rastelli 7 times, and when Matthew hit the ground, Kevin Ellis did not call 911 immediately. He waited. 8 minutes passed. 8 minutes during which Kevin Ellis could have been calling for help. 8 minutes during which an ambulance could have been on the way. 8 minutes during which Matthew Rastelli could potentially have been saved. What was happening in those 8 minutes? Prosecutors argued that Kevin Ellis and his family were cleaning up. They were staging the scene. They were placing a knife in Matthew's hand, in his non-dominant hand, positioned backward, to create the illusion of self-defense. They were creating a narrative, a false narrative, a lie designed to convince police that Kevin Ellis had acted in self-defense, that he had killed Matthew Rastelli because Matthew had come at him with a knife, that he had no choice. But the evidence did not support that narrative. Matthew Rastelli had not been armed. Matthew Rastelli had not come at Kevin Ellis with a knife. Matthew Rastelli had walked into a house expecting to see his wife and his children, and instead had been executed by his brother-in-law. The knife found in his hand was planted. It was part of the cover story. It was a prop in a performance designed to fool law enforcement. Police arrived at the scene after that 8-minute delay. They found Matthew Rastelli dead on the floor. They found the knife in his hand. They took Kevin Ellis's statement. He told them he had shot in self-defense. He told them Matthew had come at him with a knife. He told them he had acted to protect himself. Police believed him at first, or at least they took his statement at face value. But as the investigation unfolded, the truth began to emerge. Text messages were recovered from Catherine's phone, messages between her and her mother discussing the plan, messages that showed premeditation, messages that showed knowledge, messages that showed intent. The tracker on Matthew's truck was discovered. The false reconciliation story was exposed, and suddenly the narrative Kevin Ellis had presented to police began to crumble. Catherine Rastelli, facing serious charges and facing the weight of the evidence, made a decision. She would cooperate with prosecutors. She would tell the truth. She would testify. And in July 2025, she pleaded guilty to murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and felony discharge of a firearm. She was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. Her children were ordered to have no contact with her. The judge said, in a statement that captured the emotional weight of what she had done, "Your children are victims of your actions." Her testimony would become the centerpiece of the case against her brother. Standing in a courtroom, Catherine testified that the plot to kill her husband was real, that her mother had conceived it, that she had participated in it, that her brother had executed it. She testified about the tracker. She testified about the text messages. She testified about the false reconciliation story. She testified that when she told her mother she was having second thoughts about the murder, her mother said something chilling. She said, "I don't care. I'm doing it anyway." Kevin Ellis stood trial in January 2026. The jury heard the evidence. They heard Catherine's testimony. They heard about the text messages, the tracker, the false reconciliation, the 8-minute delay, the knife planted in a dead man's hand. They heard everything. And then they made a decision that would confuse many observers of the case. Kevin Ellis was found guilty of murder. He was found guilty of obstruction of justice. He was found guilty of domestic violence in the presence of a child. He was found guilty of possession of a firearm as a restricted person. But he was found not guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. The jury acquitted him of the very crime that the evidence seemed to scream that he was guilty of, the very crime that his own sister had testified about, the very crime that the text messages between his mother and sister documented. The verdict was, in the words of legal observers, perplexing. How could a jury convict someone of murder but acquit them of conspiracy to commit that murder? How could the evidence of planning be so overwhelming, but the conspiracy charge fail? The answer lies in the specific legal definition of conspiracy and the burden of proof required to meet it. The jury apparently believed that Kevin Ellis had pulled the trigger. The jury apparently believed that he had deliberately shot Matthew Rastelli 7 times. But the jury did not believe, or was not satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt, that he had conspired with the others to commit that murder. Perhaps the jury believed that Kevin Ellis had been coerced. Perhaps they believed that his mother and sister had put him in a position where he felt he had no choice. Perhaps they believed that he was a participant in an execution rather than a planner of a conspiracy. Whatever their reasoning, they convicted him of murder but acquitted him of conspiracy. In March 2026, Kevin Ellis was sentenced. The judge imposed consecutive sentences: 15 years to life for murder, 1 to 15 years for obstruction of justice, additional sentences for the other convictions, all to run consecutively, meaning one sentence would follow another, meaning Kevin Ellis would spend the rest of his life in prison. At his sentencing, a jail call he had made was played in court. In that call, Kevin Ellis said something that haunted observers. He said, "I should have said no." Those 5 words, spoken from a jail cell by a man facing life in prison, captured the reality of his situation. He should have said no. He should have said no when his mother and sister approached him with this plan. He should have said no when they asked him to kill Matthew Rastelli. He should have said no to the conspiracy. He should have said no to the murder. He should have said no to the entire scheme. But he did not say no. And now he would spend the rest of his life in prison because of that decision. But Kevin Ellis's mother, Tracy Grist, was still on trial. While her son was being sentenced, her case was just beginning. She faced charges of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and domestic violence in the presence of a child. Her trial began in April 2026. Her own daughter testified against her. The text messages were presented again. The evidence of planning was laid out again. And on April 22, 2026, Tracy Grist was found guilty on all charges. The jury was more decisive in her case. They convicted her not only of murder, but also of conspiracy to commit murder. They found her guilty of obstruction of justice. Prosecutors had successfully argued that Tracy Grist was the mastermind of the plot, that she had orchestrated it, that she had researched similar cases, that she had planned every detail, that she was the reason Matthew Rastelli was dead. And the jury agreed. Tracy Grist's sentencing was scheduled for June 10th, 2026. At the time of this video, that sentencing has not yet occurred, but she faces potentially life in prison for her role in her son-in-law's death. She faces potentially life in prison for the conspiracy she orchestrated. She faces potentially life in prison for the family she destroyed. Her daughter is in prison. Her son is in prison. Her son-in-law is dead. The grandchildren she presumably wanted to raise have been traumatized by what happened and have been separated from their mother. The price of her obsession with true crime, the price of her plan to orchestrate a murder, has been catastrophic. This case raises uncomfortable questions about family loyalty and family betrayal. It raises questions about how far a person will go to orchestrate harm against someone they know. It raises questions about the legal system and how conspiracy can be so obvious in evidence but so difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. It raises questions about the difference between planning a murder and executing a murder, and whether the law adequately captures both. Matthew Rastelli was lured to his death by his own wife. He was murdered in his mother-in-law's home. His blood was spilled in a room where he thought he would be reunited with his family. His last moments were spent realizing that the person he loved most had set him up for execution. And his children, his two young children, will grow up knowing that their mother conspired to kill their father, and their uncle pulled the trigger, and their grandmother masterminded the plot. This is the Kevin Ellis case, a case where a family conspired to commit murder, where a mother orchestrated the death of her son-in-law, where a sister lured her own husband to his death, where a brother executed that husband in cold blood, where a jury convicted for murder but acquitted for conspiracy, and where the price paid is measured not in convictions alone, but in a family utterly destroyed, in children orphaned by the actions of their own parents, and in a man dead because the people closest to him decided he needed to disappear.